The air in the house was thick with silence. It clung to the walls like the remnants of a long gone memory, pressing down on everything, from the furniture to the bookshelves. There were moments when she almost swore she could still hear him, his footsteps echoing in the hall, his voice humming the songs they used to sing together, the soft creak of his chair as he sat at the dinner table. Jacques had been gone for 2 years now, and while the rest of the world had moved on, it felt like time had come to a standstill in her little home. Her name was Claire, and she had always been the kind of woman who prided herself on resilience. But after Jacques passed, that resilience felt like a brittle shell, cracking under the weight of loneliness. She told herself time and time again that she would be fine, that life would get easier, but it didn't. The absence of his presence became a constant ache in her chest, one she couldn't seem to ease no matter how many distractions she tried. She'd been seeing a therapist, and while the sessions helped, they never seemed to go far enough. The pain was still there, a quiet, insistent companion that followed her from room to room. She thought about the old house they had built together, the house that still held every trace of him. The day the idea came to her, it was as if it appeared out of nowhere, a fleeting thought that lingered long enough to take root. A dog, she muttered aloud to herself while standing in the middle of the living room, looking out the window at the distant street. Maybe that's what I need. She had never been particularly fond of animals, not like Jacques had. But the loneliness was becoming unbearable, and maybe having a companion would help. Someone to fill the emptiness left behind, she called the shelter that afternoon. The next few days passed in a blur. She visited the local animal shelter, looking at the dogs there, wondering which one might be a suitable companion for her. The faces of each dog seemed to stare at her with a silent pleading, but it wasn't until she saw Jerry that she felt a shift inside her. Jerry wasn't the cutest dog in the shelter. He was a mixed breed with shaggy fur that looked like it hadn't been brushed in weeks and eyes that were too intelligent for his scruffy face. When she first approached him, he didn't immediately jump or wag his tail. He merely stared at her, tilting his head slightly as if sizing her up. And then he did something that completely caught her off guard. He gently nudged his nose against the bars of the cage, a silent request for her attention. Without thinking, Claire reached out to Hiei, came home with her that afternoon. His paws scuffed the floor as he wandered through the house, sniffing everything, marking his territory with the excitement of a new beginning. Claire followed him around as he explored every corner, her heart racing with an odd mix of excitement and apprehension. She was grateful for his presence, for the way he seemed to fill the house with life again. The first night Jerry spent with her, she allowed him to sleep beside her. She had expected some discomfort, the awkwardness of sharing her bed with a creature she barely knew, but there was none of that. He curled up beside her, his head resting against her side, and for the first time in months, Claire felt the stirrings of something resembled Jerry's warmth seeped into her, the steady rise and fall of his breathing like a lullaby, and she found herself closing her eyes, her body relaxing, for den Sound Norning to the sound Jerry's gentle soaring beside her, and for a moment, Shirkorn moment. Cider and for sincerely tired. And from her, she forgot the ache in her heart, the hole that Jock had left behind, the years of grief that had weighed her down. Instead, there was just Jerry lying beside her, a new companion in the strange, quiet world she had built for herself. Over the next few weeks, Jerry became more than just a dog to her. He was her companion, her confidant, the one who stayed by her side when she couldn't bear to be alone. His presence was constant, always there to provide comfort in the form of a wagging tail or a gentle nudge. Claire found herself talking to him as if he could understand every word, as though he could somehow fill the emptiness in her heart that Jock had left behind. There were times when she would sit in the living room reading a book or watching TV, and Jerry would lay at her feet, his eyes never leaving her face. In those moments, Claire couldn't help but think that maybe Jacques was watching over them, that he had sent Jerry into her life to help her heal. One evening, after a particularly long day, Claire found herself walking to the kitchen, Jerry following closely behind her. She poured herself a glass of wine, and as she turned around to head back to the living room, she was surprised to see Jerry sitting by her feet, staring up at her with his big brown eyes. I don't know what I'd do without you, Jerry, she murmured, scratching his ears absent-mindedly. Jerry's tail thumped softly against the floor and minced ackley what she met, as if he'd understood ackley what she meant. Claire smiled at him, her heart warming. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. Little did she know this quiet, unassuming dog was about to change everything for her. As the days went on, Claire found herself more and more attached to Jerry. She began to see him less as a dog and more as a companion, even a confidant. At night, she allowed him to sleep beside her, the warmth of his body a comfort that helped ease her loneliness. There were moments when, in the stillness of the night, Claire would lie awake, her mind drifting to Jacques and then to Jerry. And then to Jerry, she would whisper his name softly as though calling to Jack, and sometimes she thought she felt a response, a shift in the air, a brush of warmth against her skin. Sometimes, just sometimes, she found herself thinking that maybe Jerry wasn't just a dog, maybe he was Jack, returned in a new form, a new life. It was a fleeting thought, one she quickly dismissed, but the more time she spent with Jerry, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that somehow, some way, he was filling the empty space Jack had left behind. As Claire sat on the couch one evening, Jerry curled up beside her, her hand resting gently on his head, she couldn't help but smile. Maybe this was what she had been waiting for all along. The comfort of companionship, the simple joy of having someone by her side again, and yet in the back of her mind, a small voice began to whisper, reminding her that things weren't as simple as they seemed. But for now, Claire pushed the thought away, content to bask in the warmth of the moment. With Jerry by her side, days bled into weeks, and Claire's life seemed to revolve around a simple, rhythmic routine. Wake up, take Jerry for a walk, feed him, let him out into the yard, and then spend the rest of the day together. The early mornings were quiet, the kind of quiet that you could almost hear in the air, thick and heavy like a blanket. Claire had grown used to it. The silence in the house didn't bother her so much anymore. Jerry, with his quiet yet steady presence, had brought a certain stability to the chaos of her emotions. But there was something else, something that Claire hadn't fully realized until now. Until now. As much as Jerry had become her companion, she found herself relying on him in ways she hadn't expected. Her emotional well being, once tied to Jacques, was now almost entirely tethered to Jerry. She began to notice small things. The way he would follow her around the house, his eyes watching her every movement with a kind of loyalty that made her feel like the center of his world. She wasn't used to that kind of attention, but it was strangely comforting. At night, when she slipped into bed, she felt Jerry settle beside her, his warm body curling up close. It had started as just a way for him to feel secure, to keep her company, but now it had become an unspoken ritual. Claire had always been cautious about getting too attached to something, especially something that couldn't stay forever. But with Jerry, the attachment grew so naturally, so quietly, that she didn't even realize how deep it had gone until it was already too late. One evening, as Claire sat on the couch reading a book, Jerry jumped up beside her, as he often did, and nestled his head in her lap. She absent-mindedly stroked his fur, lost in her thoughts. For a moment, the world outside seemed distant, like it didn't matter. She thought about Jack, about how she would never hear his voice again, about how the world had moved on without her, leaving her behind in a quiet house filled with memories. And yet, here was Jerry, as though he could fill the gap, as though he could fill the gap, as though his warmth could fill the void. She wondered briefly if he could understand the depth of her grief, if he could sense the remnants of Jacques' presence that still lingered in the corners of the house. It was a fleeting thought, one that she dismissed almost immediately. Jerry was just a dog, after all. Or at least that's what she kept telling herself. The shift was subtle at first, barely noticeable. It started with small, almost insignificant changes. Jerry becoming more insistent in his desire to be close to her, his nudges and movements at night becoming more frequent, more intentional. At first, Claire didn't think much of it. After all, dogs were naturally affectionate, and Jerry had always been a bit clingy. But it was only now that she noticed how much more present he seemed to be. One night, after she had come home late from a meeting, she walked into the living room to find Jerry sitting by the door as though waiting for her. He didn't greet her with his usual wag of the tail. Instead, he just stared at her, those dark eyes following her every move. "Hey, Jerry," she said, trying to break the tension she felt suddenly creeping up her spine. He didn't respond, but his gaze never left her. There was something different in the way he looked at her, something that made her pause for a moment, her heart beating just a little faster. She chalked it up to her own weariness. Maybe she was just imagining things, but the feeling lingered, nagging at her just beyond the reach of her conscious mind. The next CDs were filled with more of the same. Jerry was constantly by her side, almost too much so. She couldn't understand why he had become so insistent on being near her all the time. When she went to the kitchen to make a cup of tea, he would sit by the door, his eyes fixed on her. When she went to the bathroom, she would open the door to find him sitting on the other side, waiting. It wasn't that he was being overly demanding, but rather it was the intensity of his attention that began to unsettle her. He seemed to be watching her in a way that was more than just a dog seeking attention. It felt as though he was waiting for something, anticipating something. One night, she awoke in the middle of the night to find Jerry lying on the edge of the bed, his face inches away from hers. His breath was soft against her skin, but his eyes were wide open, fixed on her. She blinked, confused, and then, in an instant, he nudged his nose against her cheek, pushing closer. "Jerry," Claire whispered, her voice thick with sleep. The dog didn't move, didn't retreat. Instead, he lay there, his body pressed against hers in an almost protective way. There was no discomfort, no hesitation. He was just there, warm and solid, and Claire found herself relaxing into the sensation, but something lingered at the back of her mind. She hadn't been used to this kind of attention from anyone, and certainly not from a dog. The next few nights, the pattern continued. Jerry would climb into bed with her, curling up next to her, his body pressed against hers in a way that felt oddly intimate, as if he was staking some claim over her space. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Claire would wake to find him nudging her, as if trying to get closer. It wasn't an overtly sexual gesture, but it was different from the typical way a dog would snuggle. At first, Claire brushed it off. It was simply the dog being affectionate, nothing more. But the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something odd about it. Something that didn't quite sit right. Her rational mind told her that it was just her own loneliness, her desire for connection, making her read too much into Jerry's behavior. But deep down, she knew something was changing between them, something she couldn't quite explain. Claire tried to ignore the growing tension. She couldn't allow herself to think too much about it, especially with how much she relied on Jerry's companionship. She was afraid to confront the truth, afraid that what she had begun to feel for him wasn't just affection, but something far more complicated. Still, there was no denying the growing intimacy between them. Jerry began to respond to her moods in ways that felt almost human. When she was sad, he would stay close, resting his head on her lap, his eyes full of empathy. When she laughed, he seemed to perk up as if delighted by her happiness. In those moments, Claire felt a deep bond with him, something that transcended the usual pet owner relationship. But then, on a cold evening in early winter, Claire was sitting by the fireplace when Jerry came up beside her. He nudged her hand, as he often did, and she absent mindedly began to scratch behind his ears. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, but there was something different this time. He wasn't just seeking affection. He was waiting, as though he knew something was about to happen. As she leaned down to kiss the top of his head, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, something that made her heart skip a beat. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a glint of recognition, a flicker of understanding that seemed far beyond what she had ever expected from a dog. It sent a chill down her spine. Claire had never considered herself the type to be dependent on anyone. She had built her life around independence, focusing on her career, her friendships, and managing her emotions in isolation. But since the day Jerry had entered her life, something had shifted. The quiet moments that filled her day, once so lonely, were now peppered with the soft thuds of Jerry's paws on the hardwood floors, the rhythmic panting as he sat by her feet. He wasn't just her companion anymore, he was her anchor. Each morning, as the sun began to peek through the curtains, Jerry was there by her side, patiently waiting for her to stir. He didn't demand attention like some dogs, but his presence was undeniable. It was in a quiet way he would nudge her hand or rest his head against her lap when she sat on the couch. She found comfort in it, but more than that, she began to realize how much she had come to rely on Jerry's affection, especially in the absence of Jacques. The house was quieter without Jacques' laugh, without his presence in the kitchen, but Jerry filled the void in a way that was almost too perfect. The way he followed her around, sitting in the corner of every room, always looking up at her with those big brown eyes, seemed to tell Claire that he understood her pain. It was a strange feeling to think that a dog could understand something as complex as grief, but she couldn't shake the thought. Jerry's gentle demeanor and calm nature were the balm to her wounded heart, and over time, she began to treat him less like a pet and more like a companion, someone who is always there. At night, Jerry would curl up at the foot of her bed, his body warm and close to hers. Sometimes, when she awoke in the middle of the night, she would find him lying near her head, his breath soft against her ear, his eyes wide open, as if watching over her. There was an intensity in his gaze that Claire couldn't explain. He wasn't just a dog, she thought. He seemed to be something more, something that understood her in a way no one else could. Despite the growing attachment, there was an undercurrent of unease that Claire couldn't quite pinpoint. It began to show itself in the little things. Jerry's insistence on staying close to her at all times, even when she was doing something as simple as brushing her teeth or folding laundry. It wasn't that he was being overly needy, but the subtlety of his attention was starting to feel a little too much, a little too constant. One evening, as Claire settled into bed, she glanced over at Jerry, who was sitting by her nightstand, his eyes locked onto her. There was no wagging of the tail, no playful bark. He simply watched her as though waiting for something. "Jerry, what is it?" she whispered. But the dog didn't respond. Instead, he padded closer to the bed and curled up next to her, resting his head on the pillow. Claire hesitated, a chill running down her spine. She wasn't sure why, but something about this moment felt off. The closeness, the way he sought her out for comfort, it was almost too intimate for a pet. "Maybe I'm just imagining things," she muttered to herself, pushing the unsettling feeling aside. But as she drifted off to sleep, Jerry remained by her side, his warmth a constant present. The days continued like this, Jerry always by her side, never far away. She tried to focus on other things, her work, her social life, her hobbies, but Jerry's presence was always there, like a shadow in her periphery. She began to feel like she couldn't breathe without him. It was as though he had become a part of her, a fixture in her life that she could no longer imagine living without. And that in itself frightened her. It wasn't until a rainy evening 2 weeks later that Claire began to realize just how deep the emotional bond had become. She had come home late from a work event, exhausted and drained, and when she entered her home, Jerry was there, sitting at the door as if he had been waiting for her. As if he had been waiting for her. His eyes were wide and expectant, but this time there was something different in them. S- Something almost knowing. "Hey there, buddy," Claire said softly, trying to brush off the growing tension she felt in the pit of her stomach. She crouched down to pet him, but Jerry didn't immediately respond. He simply looked at her, his gaze unwavering. His body was tense, as if he was preparing for something. A shiver ran down Claire's spine, but she shook it off, telling herself it was just the weather making her anxious. Jerry had been acting a bit strange lately, but she didn't know if it was because she had started reading too much into his behavior or if there was something truly odd going on. At night, as she lay in bed, Jerry climbed up beside her, settling into his usual spot at the foot of the bed. But this time, when Claire reached out to scratch his ears, she noticed that he was more insistent than usual, nudging her hand toward his face, pressing his body against hers with a force she hadn't expected. It was an odd sensation, like he was demanding her attention in a way that she couldn't quite explain. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just a dog being affectionate, but the feeling of discomfort lingered. "Good night, Jerry," Claire whispered. But the dog didn't move. He simply lay there, his body pressed against hers, as though waiting for her to do something. For the first time in weeks, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Days passed, but Claire couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that followed her every time she was near Jerry. It wasn't just the way he stayed so close to her, his body always touching hers, always following her wherever she went. It was the subtle shift in the way he looked at her, the intensity in his gaze that seemed to go beyond the simple affection a dog would have for its owner. It was almost as though he was trying to communicate something Claire wasn't sure she was ready to hear. One evening, after another long day at work, Claire walked into her house to find Jerry sitting near the door again, waiting for her. This time, there was no wagging of the tail, no joyful bark. He was silent, still, his eyes fixed on her. She had grown used to his attention, but tonight it felt different. "Jerry," Claire said, her voice soft but strained. "What's going on with you?" Though didn't respond, but as she walked past him to hang up her coat, she felt his gaze follow her every movement. His stare was so intense that it sent a shiver up her spine. Suddenly, Jerry moved closer, nudging her leg with his nose. She froze, her heart racing. Her heart racing. For a split second, she thought she saw something in his eyes, a recognition, a desire, something that made her take a step back. She couldn't explain it, but the air between them felt charged, like there was an invisible line that had been crossed. "Stop it, Jerry," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. But Jerry didn't listen. Instead, he moved even closer, pressing his body against hers as if to seek comfort. The moment felt too intimate, too strange. Claire took a deep breath, forcing herself to push the uncomfortable thoughts away. She didn't want to confront the reality of what was happening, of the bond she had unknowingly formed with Jerry. It was just a dog, she told herself. But as she felt Jerry's body press against hers once again, she couldn't help but wonder, was this truly just affection or was something more complicated at play? The next few days were filled with tension that Claire couldn't ignore. Jerry's behavior became more pronounced, his nudges, his insistent proximity, the way he would seek her out in every room. He had always been a needy dog, but this was different. It was though his trying to communicate something beyond what a dog should be capable of. Claire's mind raced. Was she overthinking things? Was she overthinking things? Was this just a dog's natural need for companionship, or was she beginning to see something more, something darker, something that she couldn't comprehend? Each night, as Jerry curled up beside her, the feeling of discomfort gnawed at her. She tried to brush it off, to focus on other things, but the tension between them was palpable. It wasn't just the physical closeness, it was the emotional weight, the way Jerry seemed to fill the spaces Jacques once occupied, the way his eyes seemed to understand her, to look through her. It was becoming too much for Claire to handle, too intense for her to ignore. The tension had been building for weeks now, every day inching closer to something Claire wasn't sure she could stop. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. Jerry's presence was suffocating. The constant pressure of his gaze, his need to be near her, to touch her, it was no longer just affection, it was obsession. A part of her had always known this would happen, but now that it was real, she didn't know how to escape. That night, it felt like everything was about to come to a head. Claire had spent the day at work, trying to ignore the weight of Jerry's presence in her life. She thought if she stayed busy enough, maybe the feeling of being trapped would pass. But as soon as she walked through the door, she was hit with the same intensity that had been building for days. Jerry was there, waiting for her. At first, it seemed like any other night. He was sitting by the door, tail wagging, as if nothing was amiss. But when Claire walked past him to drop her keys on the table, she noticed something different. His posture was rigid, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her feel exposed. There was a sense of purpose in the way he moved, an urgency in his actions that hadn't been there before. She tried to push the thought out of her mind. You're just being paranoid, she told herself. But the knot in her stomach told a different story. She walked to the kitchen, needing to clear her head. But Jerry followed, his paws clicking softly against the floor as he trailed behind her, never breaking his focus. She tried to shake it off as he sat by her feet, looking up at her with those deep, intense eyes, but the feeling of discomfort continued to grow. That night, when Claire went to bed, she could already feel the familiar weight of Jerry on the mattress. And the mattress? At first, he had been content to lie at the foot of the bed, but now he was always near her. His presence was a constant. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm her mind, but she could feel Jerry's eyes on her. And when she turned toward him, she saw him watching her, unmoving, his gaze unblinking. It was as if he were waiting for her to make the first move, waiting for her to acknowledge the bond between them. Claire swallowed hard, her breath shallow. "Why are you looking at me like that, Jerry?" she whispered into the silence. But Jerry didn't answer. He never did answer. He just lay there, watching her. Suddenly, without warning, Jerry shifted. He didn't just move toward her, he crawled across the bed until he was right next to her, his fur brushing against her skin. Claire's heart skipped a beat. His warmth, his closeness, she had never felt so trapped. She pushed him away, but he resisted. Jerry's body was like a weight pressing into hers, and it felt as though he wouldn't let her go. "Stop," Claire murmured, her voice shaking. "Please stop." But Jerry didn't stop. He nudged her again, his body pressing harder against her side. She felt the tension in his muscles, the insistent demand in his actions. He wasn't just seeking comfort anymore. This was something else, something unfamiliar. Something that made her feel like she was losing control. The thought hit her like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just affection anymore. It was possessiveness, it was manipulation, it was something dark. She recoiled, pulling away from Jerry, her back pressed against the headboard as she tried to regain her space. But he followed. He was always there. His body was warm against hers, his breathing steady and deliberate. It was like he was forcing her to stay in this space with him, to be just as close as he needed her to be. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she realized there was no escape. She had never felt so powerless. She wasn't just afraid of Jerry, she was afraid of what she was becoming, afraid of how she had let this bond grow so twisted. Her emotions, her thoughts, everything was clouded by the tension in the room. And now she could no longer ignore what was happening between them. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. She thought of calling for help, of running out of the house, but she knew deep down that she couldn't. Not anymore. The connection between her and Jerry had become too strong, too all encompassing. It was as though he could read her every thought and she was powerless to stop him. "Why is this happening?" Claire whispered, her voice breaking. She felt like she was drowning in the suffocating weight of the situation. As if on cue, Jerry moved closer, pressing his head against her chest, his eyes closing for a brief moment. But then, just as suddenly, he opened them again, and Claire felt his gaze like a silent command, a challenge. There was no turning back now. "Please," Claire whispered, her voice desperate, her hands trembling as they reached to push Jerry away once more. But the dog didn't budge. He was stronger now, more insistent. His presence, once comforting, was now a force she could no longer control. She tried to reason with herself, tried to convince herself that this was all just a misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in judgment. But deep inside, she knew the truth. This wasn't normal. This wasn't love. It was something far darker. As Claire lay there, trapped in the warmth of Jerry's body, she couldn't help but wonder, how had this happened? How had she allowed it to go this far? The night stretched on in oppressive silence, and Claire knew that whatever was coming next, she was no longer in control. Days passed in a haze, each moment more suffocating than the last. Claire's life had become a blur of confusion, isolation, and fear. She had tried to fight it, to push Jerry away, but every time she did, he seemed to come back even stronger. It wasn't just that he followed her everywhere he was watching her. Always, she had tried calling a friend, tried to tell herself that maybe she was just overthinking it. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she wasn't imagining it. Jerry wasn't just a dog anymore, he was something else. Something that had woven itself so deeply into her life that she could no longer see where she ended and he began. It wasn't just love, it was possession, obsession. Claire couldn't stand it any longer. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale. She hadn't been eating, barely sleeping, and when she did sleep, it was always with Jerry lying beside her. It felt like she was losing herself, like she was fading into the background of her own life, becoming just another object for Jerry to control. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she whispered to her reflection. But there was no answer. Only the soft, insistent tapping of Jerry's paws on the floor as he entered the room. When Jerry approached her that night, Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine. He'd been more distant these past few days, but something about tonight felt different. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Claire felt like he could see right through her, into the very core of her being. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just leave me alone." But Jerry didn't respond. He simply sat there, staring at her with those unblinking eyes. The silence in the room was deafening. Claire backed away, retreating to the farthest corner of the room, her heart racing in her chest. She knew this couldn't go on. She had to escape. But how? Where could she go? She couldn't escape Jerry, not physically, and certainly not mentally. He was embedded in her life, in her soul. As she turned to leave the room, Jerry followed, always a step behind, his presence looming like a dark shadow. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she moved quickly toward the door. She had to get out, had to break free before it was too late. But just as her hand reached the door handle, Jerry lunged forward, blocking her path. "Jerry, no!" Claire cried out, her voice breaking as she tried to push him away, but Jerry was stronger than she had ever realized. His body pressed against her, his fur like a suffocating weight, and she could feel his breath on her skin. He wasn't going to let her go. Not now. Not ever. For the first time, Claire understood. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about control. It was about Jerry's need to dominate, to own her completely. And she had been complicit in it. She had allowed it to go this far. She had let him become her everything, and now it was too late to undo it. With a final desperate push, Claire managed to break free from his grip and run out of the room. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cool night air hitting her face. But even as she stood there gasping for breath, she knew she couldn't escape the feeling that Jerry was still with her, following her, watching her every move. That night, she didn't sleep. She couldn't. Instead, she sat on the couch trying to think of a way out, but every plan she came up with felt hopeless. She had no one to turn to, no way to fight back. Jerry had become her reality, her nightmare. And the worst part was, she didn't know if she even wanted to escape anymore. Somewhere deep inside, a part of her still craved the closeness, the intimacy that Jerry had given her. Even though it was suffocating, it felt like the only thing that kept her alive. The next morning, Claire woke to an eerie silence. She hadn't slept, but somehow she felt strangely refreshed. The oppressive weight of the previous days had lifted, though she knew it wouldn't last. Jerry was still there, somewhere in the house, but for the first time, Claire felt a sense of resolve within her. She had to end it. The house felt different, now emptier, as though something had shifted in the very air. Claire knew she couldn't keep living this way. She had been through too much already, and now she was facing the ultimate question. What kind of life was this? As she stood in the living room, contemplating her next steps, Jerry appeared. He was standing at the entrance, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. She didn't flinch this time. She just stared back. "Jerry, it's over," Claire said, her voice firm, though her hands were trembling. "You can't control me anymore." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, Jerry approached her. But this time, Claire didn't retreat. She stood her ground, refusing to let him take control again. He circled her once, his movements slow and deliberate, as if assessing her. And then, to her surprise, he stopped. It was almost as if he understood. For the first time in weeks, Claire felt a strange sense of peace. Jerry wasn't going to hurt her anymore. He wasn't going to hold her captive. The power had shifted, and for the first time, Claire felt free. But the freedom came with a price. Claire knew she couldn't stay in this house anymore, not with the memories of everything that had happened, not with Jerry lingering in the corners of her mind. She packed a bag and left, leaving the house behind. As she stepped into the world outside, Claire knew her life would never be the same. But she also knew that, for the first time in a long while, she was truly free. Free from Jerry, free from the suffocating control he had once held over her. And as she walked away, she couldn't help but wonder, what had she learned from all of this? That love could be beautiful, but it could also be dangerous. That sometimes the line between affection and obsession could blur in ways that were almost impossible to see until it was too late. But Claire had learned one thing for sure. She was in control of her own life now. And no one, not even Jerry, could take that away from her.